You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
We've got a lot to talk about. Of course, all the issues we're discussing here when it comes to fiscal policy, monetary policy, funding the government in Washington, all plays in to what Charlie's talking about in the markets and what the Fed's going to be dealing with today. The speaker is sounding more optimistic this morning. We're 11 days out now to a possible government shutdown, and Kevin McCarthy telling reporters, we are going to solve this problem. That's the line this morning. We're making some progress, he says. Not sounding terribly upbeat last evening when an attempt to get a vote on the floor, a procedural vote just to move forward with the stopgap budget, was pulled off the floor because he didn't have the votes, sounding frustrated as he headed back to the speaker's chambers.
Think about what they're voting against. They're voting against even bringing the bill up to have a discussion about it, to vote on it. If you're opposed to the bill, vote against the bill at the end. You've got more than 170 amendments. You could change it if you don't like it. But the idea that you vote against a rule to even bring it up doesn't make sense to me.
Makes no sense, he says. But waking up this morning, having spoken to some people, presumably feeling better about things, but we still have no real path forward. There's no plan B here that we're looking at. The Problem Solvers Caucus, again, apparently cooking up something that they might present in the waning hours of this debate, but we're waiting for something concrete, and that's why we want to talk to Douglas Holtz-Eakin. It's been a while. The president of the American Action Forum. He spent time, as I mentioned, on both sides of this issue as the Chief Economist, Council of Economic Advisors, and the Director of the Congressional Budget Office. So, Douglas, what's your thought here? Because a lot of Washington seems to think that a shutdown is inevitable at this point. It's good to have you back. What's your thought?
Well, I understand why they think it's inevitable. There doesn't appear to be anything that can pass the House with strictly Republican votes and then pass the Senate, where they're going to need 60, and so they need bipartisan support. In the absence of that, the government closes because Democrats in the House have no incentive to participate and let the Republicans off the hook. They'll let them take the blame for shutting the government. Then they'll come back and pass something in a bipartisan fashion in both houses, and this will be behind us. But we first have to go through the ritual of shutting the government, and hopefully that is very short-lived and has a very small impact on the American people.
Bloomberg Intelligence is putting, I believe, 70% odds on a shutdown that would last roughly a week. We've heard from some Republican members say, get ready for a 10-day shutdown. At what point, Douglas, does the duration matter?
Well, the duration matters because, while lots of essential government activities will continue, there are things that people think are essential in their lives that will not happen. So if, for example, you want to close on a home and you need flood insurance, if they close on September 30th, we're not going to have a national flood insurance program. New policies can't be issued. People can't close on their homes. Is that a big macro event? No. Is it a nuisance in an American person's life? Yes, absolutely. And passports don't get renewed and all sorts of the routine functions of government get interrupted. People don't like it. And every day that it goes on, congressmen hear about it, and pretty soon it's over.
So let's say they blow it. Your view as the former director of the CBO, at what point will the calculation be made then, if this, say, goes beyond a week or beyond a weekend, on what we pay for? How will those decisions be made? Is that the Office of Budget Management, or is this CBO overseeing this? Where does it come together?
So there are some shutdown rules that have been drafted, guidance that will come from the Office of Management and Budget, and they'll send it out to all the agencies, and they will identify essential employees who must show up for work, whether they're paid or not, and the others will be furloughed. And then the Treasury will have the responsibility of using its cash as available to pay bills as possible. And the responsibility will lie there.
Kevin McCarthy says he's asked the White House to work with Congress and not just send requests for supplemental. What role should the president be playing in this?
Well, I mean, I think you think about the end game. The end game is there's a large omnibus appropriations bill that gets drafted in the Senate and thus can get bipartisan support. It, by definition, has to have the support of the White House. There's no point in vetoing such a vehicle. It will have in it whatever necessary funds for the disaster relief fund, which is a real pressing issue. FEMA is running out of money, and any additional funding for Ukraine supplementals. And it will come over from the Senate to the House. It will pass with both the support of Democrats, who the White House will be getting lined up, and Republicans who choose to support it. And that's where we'll end up. So if I'm the White House, I'm shaping what does that look like right now, because you want to have that ready to go as soon as possible.
So the first matter to deal with here is potential continuing resolution. There are a number of Republican members of the House who say, hell no. We've heard about triggering a motion to vacate if that happens. But that's number one. I just want to get your take on these because the CR buys some time, maybe a month. Do you think, first of all, that will pass?
I don't. And I don't have any special insight. I'm listening to Bloomberg and reading the papers like everyone else. But if you start counting on your fingers, you get to 5 Republicans who have said they will not support a CR. Well, they can't lose 5 votes. So that doesn't appear to have a path forward at the moment. They might be able to add on to a CR some additional supplements, like the disaster relief, to make it more enticing.
Yeah, right.
That'll get it out of the House, but the Senate won't pass that. The Senate will insist on Ukraine funding, and that won't pass the House. So this is where I see the logjam. It's the initial bill that won't make it through because House Democrats have no incentive to participate, and House Republicans can't muster the votes. That's the real problem.
Well, that's fascinating because a lot of people are looking at the end of the year, maybe walking up the holidays. You think it just happens now? The fiscal year, we go into a shutdown in October.
I think it happens quickly. Bluntly, I think there's some members of the House who want to shut the government, and they have the power to do it. I mean, if you can get 4 of your friends, it's over. So that'll happen because they want it to happen and they have the ability to make it happen. And then we start figuring out the realistic future where the Congress of the United States funds the federal government, which has to happen and will happen. And the question is, how long is the disruption that we have to suffer before we get to that business?
It's looking like the Ukraine funding will not be part of a continuing resolution. That appears to be a deal breaker. Right. But to your point, you're not passing a budget without some increase in funding here to get it through the Senate. A lot of this might hinge on this meeting tomorrow when President Zelenskiy comes to Washington. Kevin McCarthy was asked again today about the questions that he and other potentially skeptical members of his conference will have for Zelenskiy when they meet. A little bit less downbeat than we heard from him 24 hours ago. Here he is.
These are hard-working taxpayer dollars. I want to make sure there's accountability where the resources are going. I want to see a plan of what we're looking for victory. And I think members will sit and have their questions as well.
I won't ask you to be a military analyst for us, Douglas, but when it comes to this issue of accountability, what would that look like? How could that actually work in a way, short of a full audit of everything that's already been spent? Maybe that's part of this. How would you sell that to members who say not necessarily no more money for Ukraine, but new accountability for Ukraine?
Well, I think the number one thing would be to have a convincing demonstration, presentation on their efforts to root out corruption and fraud in Ukraine. This has been an ongoing issue. People have lost their jobs over it, so it's not a secret. And some members are nervous about sending more money to a government that has an ongoing corruption problem, and the money may not be going to fight military wars. So, that I think is the key. What evidence he can bring about his efforts to clean up the operation of his government, I'm not sure, but I think that's the key issue.
So a shutdown in October, when do we actually get a budget for next fiscal year, Douglas, or am I just asking too much right now?
Well, there isn't going to be a budget for next fiscal year. So as it turns out, while we're having this conversation, the House Budget Committee has finally marked up a budget resolution, something it should have done in March. And the Senate Budget Committee has no intention of doing one, and neither chamber is going to vote on a budget. So we have flunked the let's budget and figure out how to govern steps. They're gone. All we're going to do is pass a very large spending bill that has enough money in different places to get 60 votes in the Senate and 218 in the House. And that's going to be a reactionary way to fund the government, not a plan, not a budget. There's nothing to be proud of in this, but we will get through it.
So much for regular order. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, don't be a stranger. It's great to have you back. Maybe we'll talk again on the other side of this thing because we've got a lot to learn still. He's the president of the American Action Forum. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington with an eye on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. Let's assemble our panel. We're going to be hearing in a few moments from Gary Gensler at the SEC, who talked to our own Kailey Leinz earlier today. But Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino jump in now as Bloomberg Politics contributors, our signature panel. As we spent some time with Douglas Holtz-Eakin, I'd love to hear from both of you with an eye on this conversation over Ukraine. You heard Kevin McCarthy talking about Ukraine, Rick. Have you heard Rand Paul? Because this is in the Senate, of course, where there's supposed to be more galvanized support, and I think we can credibly say that there is for the war in Ukraine. But the senator for Kentucky is apparently done. Here's what he said on the House floor.
It's not just that this is not helping our national security. The very threat to our national security is our debt. The more we send money overseas, the more we deplete our munitions, the worse things get. No matter how sympathetic we are to the Ukrainian people, we must put the American people first. And to that end, I encourage my colleagues to oppose any effort to hold the federal government hostage for Ukraine funding.
So, Rick Davis, Rand Paul apparently the one to crystallize the argument against Ukraine funding. Will others join him in the Senate?
Very few. I mean, there are some that have expressed reservations about the use of the funds for Ukraine. And Rand Paul, though, is in a distinctly minority position. I mean, you probably have 85 to 90 Senate votes, both parties, that support increasing funding and support for Ukraine. And I don't know what he thinks about, like, holding on to all those munitions. Is he waiting for Russia to invade Florida and then he'll go ahead and use them, or what's his plan, right? I mean, I don't understand the idea that we don't want to use the weapons we make to create peace around Europe, especially. So it's a frustrating thing to hear him talk, but not many people are listening, certainly not other senators. And so he's making news, but he's not making history.
What does this tell those negotiating a budget plan, though, Jeanne? It's not getting any easier here in the House. And now you've got a senator crystallizing an argument that others might be able to lift, others on the House side who are pushing back on Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I have talked to several people in the last couple days who privately have expressed concern, as much as they support Ukraine in the effort against Russia, expressed concern about making the case that this is in the interest of the United States to keep spending this money. And so I do think that this argument, I agree, it probably doesn't have, many legs in the Senate. It's going to give some oxygen to some of these Republicans in the House. But I do think there is a necessity for the administration and for Volodymyr Zelenskiy when he comes to make the case, and he's making it forcefully right now in the UN, that this is in the interest of the United States, of democracies around the world, and that we have an obligation here, because this is something you do hear Americans scratching their head about. So as frustrating as Rand Paul is, I think he's raising something that does need to be addressed straight on to make this case. And I think the president tried yesterday, but more needs to be done on this score so we move public opinion on this issue. It's critical.
Well, the democracy argument is clearly not enough for everybody, Rick. When it comes to accountability, what kind of a system could be put in place that would give skeptics the ability to track the money?
Well, first of all, I mean, there's not a penny that's spent that we don't have, federal government employees tracking where it goes and what it does. And the vast majority of this, remember, these are checks that are going to the U.S. defense industrial complex. They're not going to Ukraine. Where do you think the munitions are coming from? We have American jobs building, this kind of weaponry and shipping it off to the Ukraine. So there's only a fraction, especially the economic aid, that's actually being spent by Ukrainians. And I'm actually encouraged by the steps that President Zelenskiy has made recently in cleaning house in the defense ministry of his own country to keep people who might see some profiteering being made to kick them out. I mean, that's really tough in the middle of a war effort to clean house like that. And kudos to him for keeping, frankly, common cause with the American taxpayer. I think we can be encouraged by that.
Fascinating conversation, as always, with Rick and Jeanne. And we add another voice to our conversation today, and that's the chair of the SEC. Bloomberg's Kailey Leinz was on Capitol Hill this morning, spent some time with the chair as he was up there for a hearing, talking about a range of issues, including this matter of a shutdown. We're trying to hear from as many policymakers as we can in Washington for their view on this. Of course, his agency would be subject to some changes in a government shutdown. And that's where Kailey began the conversation with the impact on financial regulation. Here he is.
I would say first, the market regulators, Securities and Exchange Commission. I'll leave Chair Benham to speak about the other great market regulator, the CFTC, but we're appropriated agencies. And so the public should understand we will largely be a skeletal staff under the laws. And so the normal oversight we have on markets will not be possible. It just simply is not for how many days that happens. Companies that want to go public may not find that their filings could even be reviewed by the SEC and the like during pendency of a shutdown. Those are the most immediate functions, but also we won't be able to oversee the markets if there's significant events or and the like.
But you don't anticipate significant events could emanate from the government shutting down potentially for a prolonged period of time that would be disruptive to the actual activity?
We have the deepest, most liquid capital markets, but the absolute base of that capital markets is our U.S. Treasury market. It's about a quarter of the market. It's $25 trillion, but it's the base. And the trust in that market is in part just that we function well, that we are able to resolve our differences in our democratic ways. But importantly, the Treasury markets will still function. They'll be trading in the stock markets. You just won't have the oversight of the market regulators.
Gary Gensler, chair of the SEC, talking with our own Kailey Leinz earlier today on Capitol Hill as we bring back Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. It's just a reminder, Jeanne, he doesn't sound terribly worried about things, but yet another element of a shutdown that we don't always think about, that's the watchdog, I guess would be put in the doghouse.
Yeah, that's right. And I think these conversations are critically important because we keep hearing from Republicans. You know, we heard from Andy Biggs in the last 48 hours. My constituents are okay with a shutdown. It's a pause, as he describes it. And the impact is going to be minimal. But as that conversation just suggested and showed us, in so many ways, the impact is real. And so I think we need to, and also to go back to your conversation earlier, you know, the reality is that you cannot run and function a government this way. This is no way to run anything, let alone a government. And so there is an impact, as much as we're told there's not. If people want to get religion on spending, God bless them, we should. But this is not the way to do it. There is damage on the other side when we proceed down this path.
Where's your head on this at this point, Rick? Obviously, a government shutdown isn't going to shake the world here. We avoided a default earlier this year. There are some Republicans like Mick Mulvaney who sat right in this room and said, hey, calm down here. We're not shutting down the government. It's a partial shutdown, and we can direct money to places that we need to go for a pretty good chunk of time. Where does duration become a problem for you?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, duration matters on those things that, checks need to be delivered. I think, Chairman Gensler makes a good point, right, is that on the regulatory agency side, well, your paperwork just sits in a bin until we get back to work. Tough luck. You should call your congressman. But in things that we need to cut checks for, military pay, things like that, especially if it goes beyond just a limited shutdown. Those really have a pinch, and those can affect us. But the latter part that he makes, and Jeanne picked up on, is, we need to quit operating like a third world country. We're supposed to be the standard of democracies around the world. We have to actually start acting like it if we want others to participate in this great democratic experiment. And we have to show them a way to do it that looks a lot better than what we're currently doing.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Rand Paul, who we heard from earlier, who's urging his colleagues to vote against increased Ukraine funding. He said this isn't a democracy anyway over there in Ukraine. They canceled their presidential election. Of course, things are a little bit difficult there at the time. But we heard from Volodymyr Zelenskiy himself in an interview with CNN, this following his address at the UN yesterday. And he was asked about Donald Trump's claims, as we hear frequently, to be able to negotiate an end to this war in 24 hours. In his first day in office, he says, not only is it possible, it'll be easy. He's speaking in English here, but I think you'll get the point in his response.
The question is to Trump, or maybe it's not his idea, or somebody, what United States really ready to give to Putin from your territories, what you are ready to give, but for the possibility not to risk after his public words about nuclear weapon.
So after Putin has invoked the possible use of a nuclear weapon, how can you negotiate with him about anything? What would you be willing to give him is what he's saying, Jeanne? How does that argument resonate tomorrow in Washington?
I think it's going to resonate incredibly strongly. And he makes a really important point. And, these are the exact points that the American public needs to hear over and over again. Rick was saying earlier something I wish the administration would say about this money. These are exactly the arguments that need to be had, because what we're hearing, or what people are hearing out there, is that we are giving billions of dollars away to a corrupt regime while we have trouble at home. That is got to be countered. And so Zelenskiy does a very good job making the case and asking Donald Trump and anybody else who has this idea, what are you planning to give up? And likewise, we have to explain to people where this money is coming from and what it's for and why it's critical. Those arguments have to be had over and over again, so people feel assured, and rightly so, that their money and their time and their energy is being well spent. And the fight that we are in, as distant that we are from it, is one that we should be in as it pertains to Russia and Ukraine.
How does President Zelenskiy need to compose himself tomorrow, Rick? He was criticized, for instance, for not wearing a suit when he addressed a joint session of Congress. He's going to be going with his hand out to Speaker McCarthy and other members who might, according to McCarthy, have some difficult questions for him. How does he approach this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously his brand is military warfare outfits, right? And yep. I guess that's part of it. But look, I think he has to be appreciative of what the United States has already done. We've done a lot. We've done more than anybody else. And I think he needs to, though, stress this urgency. These aren't, these arguments that people are making against this aren't moral equivalents. If Vladimir Putin is able to threaten Western countries with nuclear weapons to leave him alone and let him take land in the Ukraine, what's to stop him from saying, hey, Germany, you got to get rid of those U.S. bases there, or I'm going to nuke,
right,
one of your cities. Or Poland, how about those missile defense systems that you just bought from the United States? Take them down, or I'm going to nuke you. I mean, this is not the kind of behavior you want to start rewarding. And so unless you take a strong stand against this one dictator, you're going to have a Europe in turmoil, which affects all of our security and economic prosperity.
We're going to be throwing to our special Fed coverage in just a couple of moments. I want to get both of you on this matter of a dress code, since we're talking about this. I guess President Zelenskiy won't need to worry about what he's wearing if he enters the Senate chamber. We told you about this in response to Senator John Fetterman's preference, wearing shorts and hoodies, and that will keep him on the floor without having to give a thumbs up from the door like he's been doing. But I just saw him presiding over the Senate. When Rand Paul made his comments on Ukraine, John Fetterman was presiding, wearing a short-sleeve shirt. And we've got a bit of an update on this. A group of 46 Senate Republicans, that's almost all of them, sending a letter to Chuck Schumer asking that he reverse his decision here to relax the Senate dress code. I believe it was Susan Collins, Rick, who said that maybe she should start wearing a bikini in the Senate. I don't know where either of your heads are on this, Rick. Is this going to turn around, or do we wait for a potential different leader? What's the future in dress code?
Yeah, I just think, I think it's a mistake. I think Chuck Schumer is lessening the value of the chamber. The Senate is the greatest deliberative body in the world, and it should look like it. And looking like it is not a weekend at Bernie's where everyone's wearing shades and shorts. And I certainly think that Susan Collins made the right point, although just the concept is just so bothersome to me that you should wake up, Chuck Schumer, and rescind and go back to a policy that really I think maintains the level of the Senate in a way it should be.
The response from John Fetterman, Jeanne, talking to The Hill newspaper, quote, "America, it's about freedom and choice. It's like a Burger King, you rule kind of thing," unquote. Is this working for you, or does this go right back when Republicans potentially take control of the Senate someday, or both all right with you?
The Burger King thing, that goes over my head completely. I do think it's a bit of a bridge too far for Susan Collins to be talking about wearing bathing suits on the floor. That's not what the majority leader is talking about. I think we should have faith that our leaders can make a dignified choice for clothing, and that the rule that they have to stand in their gym shorts on the, with 1 foot in the cloakroom and 1 foot on the floor to vote is a little bit old-fashioned at this point, and let them have their way. And good for Zelensky. He's in a war. He should wear his military dress.
All right, so that was my follow-up there. Go with the olive thing and wear the suit. Thanks for listening to the Sound On podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at 1 p.m. Eastern Time at Bloomberg.com.